Ukraine shuts off Russian gas to Europe through its territory after a pre-war deal expires. Yet Russian gas supplies to the EU by ship are at record levels. Are Western fuel sanctions imposed over the Ukraine war hurting Europe more than Russia? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. The Ukraine war has led to the West imposing some of its harshest sanctions on Russia. Pipeline supplies have been drastically cut, yet Russian liquid natural gas is being shipped into Europe at record levels. While the war continues, Europe's most important economy, Germany, has slid into recession. So, have fuel sanctions against Russia worked out as planned, or are they hurting Europe more than Russia? We'll talk to our guests shortly, but first, this report from Victoria Gatenby.
Russia and the Soviet Union spent half a century becoming a major supplier of gas to Europe. But the war in Ukraine has all but destroyed that business for the state energy giant Gazprom. And now Russia's oldest gas supply line to the European Union through Ukraine has shut after a 5-year deal between Moscow and Kyiv expired.
We were always in favour of gas supplies, of the supplies being above politics, of them being purely economic matters. We never said no to supplies to Europe.
Ukraine earned nearly $1 billion in transit fees last year, but it says payments for the gas have helped Russia to wage its war on the country. Russia is expected to lose $5 billion annually. The European country most affected by the end of the transit deal is Moldova. It's not part of the European Union. It's been forced to impose a 60-day state of emergency in its energy sector. Before Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, it was the biggest supplier of gas to the bloc, providing more than 40% in 2021. But since reducing its dependency after that invasion, the EU imported about 8% in 2023.
There are alternatives, but they tend to be a bit more expensive than the Russian pipeline gas. The impact will be felt especially in Austria, in Hungary and Slovakia, where the price of gas will likely rise. And this could have an impact on consumer prices, on the cost of living, but also on prices for industry.
Most Russian gas routes to Europe are shut, including the Nord Stream 2 pipeline under the Baltic that was blown up in 2022. But the shutdown of the pipeline through Ukraine will not stop Russian gas from entering Europe. The Turk Stream pipeline is still operational, supplying gas first to Turkey, then to Hungary and Serbia. And imports of Russian liquefied natural gas to the EU reached record highs last year, raising questions about the effectiveness of sanctions on Russia that are designed to limit funding for its war in Ukraine. Victoria Gatenby, Al Jazeera for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. Ben Aris is a founder and editor-in-chief at Business News Europe. He joins us from Berlin. Natasha Fielding is editor at Argos Media, an energy and commodity price agency. She joins us from London, and Alex Titov is a lecturer at Queen's University Belfast and a specialist in Russian foreign policy. He joins us from Vicenza in Italy. A warm welcome to you all. I want to start with Alex first. So we have this new reality where there's no Russian gas coming in via Ukraine. But is it as simple to say that Russia has somehow beaten Europe's sanctions?
Depending on what you want to see the kind of effective sanctions were originally intended to be. If they were intended to be to collapse Russian economy and to make it financing of the war impossible, they obviously have failed. Russia has continued to accumulate foreign reserves. It still gets a lot of money from selling energy to the world markets. If you think about Europe's dependency, alleged dependency on Russian gas, which I think since it's all been cut, we've seen that it's been hugely exaggerated, and Europe has not, stopped functioning without Russian gas. Then equally, Russia hasn't stopped functioning without selling its gas to Europe. So either side have been lost, or obviously Russia has lots of revenues from gas, but I have to say that most of Russian revenues from selling energy comes from oil anyway. Whereas Gazprom, Russian state monopoly for gas, has been hit very hard in terms of losing its most lucrative market to sanctions. The Russia itself has been able to finance, its war and its economy because it has alternative supplies to Europe, which including building up new supplies to places like India, which it never sold before. For gas, it's much more difficult for Russia, but so it's not so easy for Europe either. So they've both been affected.
Natasha, one of the things that's interesting about all of this is there seems to be, certainly for Russia and for European countries that want cheaper gas or try and get more gas, is there are loopholes in these sanctions that have been exploited. I mean, the sanctions are pretty useless, are they?
So interestingly, there are not any direct sanctions preventing Russian pipeline gas or Russian liquefied natural gas from entering Europe. We saw a dramatic reduction in Europe's Russian pipeline gas imports in 2022. That was not down to direct sanctions, and we are still seeing strong deliveries of liquefied natural gas into Europe from Russian terminals. So in that sense, also this momentous day for the European gas market, where Ukrainian transit halted, that was really not down to sanctions, but rather to the expiry of the Russia-Ukraine transit deal and to Ukraine's unwillingness to sign a new deal for that transit to continue.
Ben, it's a very interesting word that Natasha has just used. It's momentous. It is a momentous day because Ukraine has said enough is enough. This is a business deal, not a sanctions deal. We can get rid of this deal if we want to. And actually, it's hurting us because those billions are being used to kill our people. So business has triumphed over sanctions, political sanctions. Is that right?
You could put it that way. I mean, the business of gas, well, as Natasha said, I mean, it should be clear that there's no sanctions on importing Russian gas, and that this is a pragmatic thing where many countries have chosen to try and wean themselves off Russian gas, Germany being the biggest example in so much as it was entirely dependent on imports of gas via pipelines. And the Nord Stream 2 pipelines were blown up in September, and those were the main pipelines that were landing in Germany. But one of the strands is still intact and could deliver gas, but Germany has taken a principled decision not to use that or restart that, despite the fact Putin offered Scholz to turn them back on again. And it switched to LNG at great expense because it had no LNG terminals, but has hired these floating terminals. But the whole business, the economics surrounding the gas, it's caused Europe a huge problem because energy prices here in Europe now are double what they were, despite there was a huge spike in prices in 2022. The prices have come down, but the prices remain double what the long-term average pre-war was. And for Ukraine, I mean, they've also cut their nose off to a certain extent because they were making $1 billion a year in transit fees, which ironically or weirdly, Gazprom was continuing to pay Kiev throughout the last 3 years of war. On the other hand, the Ukrainians are arguing that the Gazprom was earning $6.5 billion a year from exporting gas to Europe. And that money was going straight back to fund the war machine. And so the Ukrainians were put in the really bizarre position whereby they were facilitating a business that Gazprom was doing that was raising money for the Kremlin that was then being poured into the war against Ukraine. And so I think this is the logic behind Zelensky's decision to forego that $1 billion, which they desperately need. I mean, Ukraine is incredibly short of cash. Nevertheless, his argument is that we will cut Russia off from this $6.5 billion in order to make it more difficult for them to fund the war. And of course, Russia is struggling to fund the war. It's running a budget deficit. The economy's overheating. It needs every penny it can earn. And now it's been cut off from a business that's been running for 50 years, In the 70s, Austria was hooked up to the pipeline. The first gas arrived in Europe. And throughout the Cold War, this gas and this business continued to flow, despite the geopolitical tensions of the Cold War. Europe continued to buy gas. And 70% of Russia's export gas capacity is pipelines run to Europe, run west. And that's now stopped largely, apart from the pipelines in the south. And Russia, has looking to transport this gas east, but there's no pipelines. And those things are incredibly expensive to build, and they take at least a decade to construct. So this is really a big historic moment where Russia's infrastructure, energy infrastructure, is now useless. It's just sitting there and can't be used. And Gazprom is being cut off from the billions and billions of dollars that it used to earn from exporting to Europe.
Natasha, Ben has just said there that the Russian infrastructure is useless. It is useless right now, but that infrastructure isn't going to go away. Is there a chance that Russia can save the day somehow by doing a strictly business deal with other countries?
So it's correct to say that now that Russian gas is no longer flowing through Ukraine and into other European countries, the gas cannot simply be redirected elsewhere. It cannot be redirected into, for example, LNG export facilities. And given that Ukraine is a key transit market for the Russian gas to enter Europe, without a deal, an interconnection agreement between Russia and Ukraine, it is impossible to have for that Russian gas to enter Europe through Ukraine. So at the moment, in terms of other available routes, the only route for Russian pipeline gas to get to Europe is through the Turkish Stream pipeline. Now, there is a little bit of scope for those flows to increase this year. The pipeline did run under capacity, but that would nowhere near make up for the loss of Ukrainian transport. And of course, China is another big sales market for Russia, but it will take a while to build additional infrastructure to ramp up those exports to China much further.
Alex Titov, there are other markets, as Natasha has pointed out, for Russian energy supplies, whether it is oil or whether it is gas. However, January 20th is coming, and it's coming very quickly. Trump will be in power in the US. Vladimir Putin is probably glad of that, thinking that he might well get a deal that's in his favor when it comes to Ukraine. Is there a way that you see that the Americans will somehow force Ukraine to accept a deal that brings back that Ukrainian transit point back in? Is that going to be part of Trump's thinking, do you think?
No, I don't think so, because first of all, for the United States themselves, they're benefiting a lot from increased energy supplies to Europe. They've been trying to replace a Russian gas pipeline with LNG, and it's been always economically more viable to buy gas from Russia. And, in Europe, it wasn't because they were doing it out of charity. It's just because Russian gas was competitive compared to other alternatives for, decades previously. There's absolutely no reason for Trump to want to have this gas to come back. But also, I think, there is a clear stated and formulated, and to an extent implemented European Commission policy of weaning Europe of Russia's gas, Russia's energy, and any trade with Russia, indeed. And it's very difficult to see why Trump would want to force it on Europeans who don't want it, force it on Ukrainians who don't want it. And Russia itself even though it was important gas supply, but they really don't want to, in an ideal set of scenarios, trade with via Ukraine either. I mean, they wanted to restart. If they wanted to restart sales to Europe, they would want to choose remaining Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which hasn't been blown up yet, the gas prospects don't look good so far for Russia. But I mean, there are alternatives. There are LNG, which I think they're finishing a new facility on the Baltic, which can use some of the gas from destined for Nord Stream. There are pipelines to China. The only problem is that the new pipeline, which would come from the Yamal Peninsula, is Chinese having very hard negotiations, and it doesn't seem to be going anywhere anytime soon. But broadly speaking, they will survive. It's not really lucrative. The rising prices domestically for Gazprom to compensate somehow for the lost revenues from Europe. But the gas pipeline would have to be, I think very few countries actually would want to have Ukrainian gas route back. And the longer it goes on, I mean, there might not be anything left of Ukrainian gas pipeline anyway, not just because Russia might bomb it, which it might, but also because, it's very expensive to maintain it without transit fees, without gas going through it, without money getting from it. I don't see where Ukraine would have the capacity, either financial or technical, to actually preserve the gas pipeline anyway in the long term.
Well, let's get into the politics of this now. Ben, one of the key things here is Germany. It's the biggest economy in Europe. It's suffering because of the principal stand that they took against getting Russian. They really led the way when it was Russian sanctions and not getting Russian products into European markets. But they're hurting now to the point where it's having an impact on domestic politics, right?
Yeah, I mean, Germany's in a horrible position. Like I say, pre-war, it was a net exporter of power, but then the double whammy they suffered, having the cheap Russian gas turned off, and Germany was a node for the rest of Europe because the Nord Stream 2 pipeline landed in Germany and then it was distributed. And Germany also has the biggest European EU storage tanks, and so it supplied a lot of countries around it, Italy in particular. And that stopped. And at the same time, they turned off the nuclear power stations. And so suddenly there's been an energy deficit. And that's costing the economy. The prices of gas in Germany, I said before that they're already twice as high as pre-war. But in Germany, they're twice as high again as the rest of Europe. And the industrial lobby here, I can tell you, they're pushing very hard to turn the gas back on through the surviving strand of the Nord Stream, which would be 25 billion cubic meters a year. And to put that into context, Europe used to import a total of 150. But the economics, I mean, Germany's gone into recession and it's been deindustrializing. That you've got a whole class of heavy factories, petrochemical plants, refineries, power that are no longer economically viable. And that problem can't be fixed. I mean, there's no short-term solution to that. And so a third of Germany's companies have already left the country because it just simply doesn't work anymore. It's too expensive to operate. And another third are talking about leaving. And so domestically, Germany's already suffering from a competitive problem. And now its energy costs are twice that of the rest of Europe, which is twice that of what it is in the States. And Germany and EU as a whole is slipping behind, and that's a problem for everybody because, as you know, it's widely said, Germany is the economic engine for Europe, and if Germany's flat on its back, which it is, then that bodes ill for the rest of the European economies going forward.
Natasha, it's a horrible word to use, but contagion coming from, Russia not being able to get its gas into Europe, and then that affecting Germany, and then Germany is going to affect smaller European countries. This is going to spread, and it is spreading right now throughout Europe, right?
Absolutely, yeah. There's a knock-on impact. So it is primarily Central and Eastern European countries that are directly affected by this halt in Ukrainian transit: Austria, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Moldova. But that suspension of Russian gas supply through Ukraine means that those countries need to replace that gas with supply from elsewhere. And Germany is a key next door market to receive the alternative gas supplies. So there will be more of a pull on gas from west to east, which will in turn require more withdrawals from German underground storage. And this really poses a challenge, not just for the rest of this winter, but for next summer, when those storage tanks, underground storage reserves, will need to be refilled ahead of the following winter. And doing that without that Russian gas through Ukraine, it creates a tighter market. And this is especially in the context of a tight global gas market. Europe has primarily replaced Russian gas with liquefied natural gas, for which it must compete with Asian buyers. And we have seen a much more competitive environment for LNG this winter than last winter.
Right.
We have this kind of combination of events.
Alex Titov, is there an opportunity then for Russia? Natasha has just said Europe could face a crisis, not this coming winter, but the next coming winter after all the gas runs out. Is there an opportunity here for Russia to either increase supplies to other buyers and try and starve Europe out? Is there any kind of opportunity here?
Well, I mean, they still continue to trade via Turkish stream, and if the price in Europe goes up, I mean, they will get more money from whatever's remaining of the gas pipeline via Turkey, plus also, of course, LNG, which they still sell to Europe. LNG, by its nature, it's a bit more like approaching oil market in the sense that it can be shipped globally. Russia has kind of building facilities to ship more to Asia, particularly building up its export from by another from Yamal Peninsula. At the moment, it's all facing westwards via Murmansk onto Europe. Europe, I think, been thinking of imposing sanctions of transport from transit, banning transit via European ports to further afield. Russia has been developing its trade route from Yamal via Kamchatka, sort of building facilities there, and then on to the East Asia, which is the traditionally been kind of more high LNG prices anyway. So Russia will benefit from increasing general tightness of the markets, of increasing in the prices for LNG, for gas, but yeah, I mean, it's the gas pipeline is such a thing that it takes years to build, and the real alternative to it is just China, and China is playing very hardball to build a power of Siberia too. I mean, China now is actually, after Ukraine stopped, buys more pipeline gas than Europe.
Right.
For the first time ever as well.
Sorry, Alex, we are running out of time, and I want to bring your points to the other guests as well. Ben, one of the words that we've heard here is weaning. Europe is trying to wean off Russian gas. When we've heard that from the Americans, is we are trying to wean off Middle Eastern oil, but it never really worked. Is there a case to be said that in a few years' time, maybe even shorter than that, that we're going to be back to business as usual when it comes to Russian gas, just because it's convenient and easy?
It's already business as usual, in so much as this idea of weaning off Russian gas is a fiction, because Europe is still dependent on Russian gas, not in the same way that it was before, when it imported 35% of its gas was Russian gas. Nevertheless, it can't do without it. And Natasha made a very good point that the tanks in Europe are already emptying at a much faster pace than they did for the last 2 years. It's not a catastrophic pace, but the tanks are on course to be pretty empty by the end of this winter. And then that gas to refill them has to come from somewhere. And without that gas, you can't get through the winter. And the other
Sorry, Ben, I'm just going to pick up on that point, because we are running out of time, and I just want to get to Natasha and to Alex as well. Natasha, have then the sanctions, the business deal of all of this idea of getting gas into Europe via Russia just been temporarily paused, and it will come back at some point?
I'd say this is one of the biggest questions on European traders' minds. Will that Russian gas come back? I think one thing we've learned from the European gas market over the past few years is that it's anything but predictable. What I would say is that Europe has now invested heavily in getting alternative supplies. It's really built up its LNG import capacity in order to make do without that Russian gas permanently. So we can't see the future. I think what happens with the war will really help to determine whether Russian gas comes back. But Europe can cope without it.
Alex Titov, just very quickly then, has the sanctions failed? Has everything that Europe was trying to do has failed, and all Russia really needs to do is just wait it out?
Not wait it out, win the war. I mean, because at the moment they are winning on the battlefield, and I think that will determine whether the gas, what happens to gas and other things. There will have to be a kind of political acceptance in Europe, maybe a change of policies in Europe as well, with new government in Germany, possibly in France in 2026, 27. That you can't defeat Russia economically, you can't defeat Russia on the battlefield, and you have to deal with it, and maybe gas will become part of the kind of larger deal with Russia to settle the Ukrainian war. But this is looking into the kind of year ahead. If nothing reverses, if Ukraine continues to lose on the battlefield, then anything can happen. What will be the big deal at the end of this war? Nobody knows.
Well, I want to thank all our guests, Ben Aris, Natasha Fielding and Alex Titov. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the whole team here, bye for now.
Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.